Hello, my name is Karen Patterson from the Rowallan and Slieve Crib Community Twinning Group. We believe passionately in local history projects, and we have commissioned a series of online lectures by historian Horace Reid. Horace has been researching our local history in County Down since 1990. Horace presents regularly to local historical societies and publishes in local newspapers. Over the years, he has compiled a wide variety of highly illustrated slideshows. We are grateful for the support from Newrymoore and Down District Council for this important historical project. I shall now hand over to Horace to introduce the presentation.
Behind me is Edenavady Hill on the Montalto estate in Ballynahinch. This was the assembly point for the United Irishmen in June 1798, and you would have seen about 5,000 of them on this hill here. The hill hasn't changed much in 200 years. It was an open space surrounded by trees. And in the warm June weather, the United Irishmen sheltered from the hot sun below the trees. There were 4 days of fighting in Ballynahinch between the 9th of June and the 13th of June. The critical action took place at the top of this hill here when Colonel Stewart and the Argyll Fencibles captured the rebels' ammunition store. So the rebels were busy fighting in the town, but their munition supply was interrupted and they ceased fire and began to retreat, and then that was the end of the battle. General Monroe fought a last stand at the top of this hill among some prehistoric fortifications. What I'm going to do now is talk you through the 4 days of fighting in Ballynahinch in June 1798. The most important event that ever happened in Ballynahinch was the battle which culminated on the 13th of June 1798. So the rebellion of the United Irishmen was a significant event in Irish history. The results of the 1798 rebellion were number one, the Act of Union, number two, the Emancipation Act of 1829, where Catholics were admitted to Parliament, and number three, the Reform Act of 1832, where the middle classes were given the vote, and that enabled Ulster Presbyterians to be admitted to Parliament as MPs. So major implications of the 98 rebellion and of the Battle of Ballynahinch. This painting shows the battle in full swing. In the back, the painting was done by Thomas Robinson, an Englishman from the Lake District who was brought over to Ulster by Bishop Percy, the Bishop of Dromore. And this painting executed not too long after the battle and went on sale in Belfast and was sold by lottery. In the background you see Slieve Crib. In the middle ground you see Montalto House. To the left of Montalto House you see Tower House still there. To the right of Montalto House you see Edenavady Hill and the rebels' green flag flying from the top of it. Extreme right of the painting you see Ballynahinch in flames. General Nugent ordered it to be set on fire. To the left of the flames is General Nugent himself facing the painting. With his tricorn hat. To the left of him is the not the Union Jack, it's the Union flag. It's the Great Britain flag prior to 1800. It's not the Union Jack. Next to that then is Mockerdroll Parish Church. The spire is still recognisable over 200 years later. In the middle, you see Captain Evatt of the Monaghan Militia, shot dead by a sniper's bullet in Dromore Street in the process of dying. To his left, a brass cannon, smoking, six-pound brass cannon, and on the ground some cannonballs. Then extreme left, you see a man being gripped by his collar. That's Hugh McCulloch, a grocer from Bangor, a United Irish colonel. He's not in uniform, but he's wearing a green cravat. And the other thing to notice about him is that his hair is cut short at a time when most men wore their hair long. So he's wearing he's got a croppy hairstyle, and the rebels of the period were called croppies. A lot of the fighting occurred around Montalto House and in the Montalto domain. So I'll mention some of the personalities of that time. Montalto House was built by the first Earl of Moray, top left, around 1760. He died 1793. So at that stage then, the estate was owned by the second Earl of Moray in the red coat on the left. The first Earl was married to Lady Elizabeth Hastings on the right. We'll hear more about her later. Prominent visitors to the house were the Reverend John Wesley, founder of Methodism. Lady Elizabeth's family in England were prominent Methodists. And John Wesley visited all the Rawdon properties in Ireland. Other prominent visitors were Bishop Percy from the Bishop of Dromore, who came to Montalto to borrow books from the extensive library owned by the first Earl. And another prominent visitor was Wolfe Tone, one of the founders of the United Irishmen, who came to Ballynahinch in hopes of recruiting the second Earl of Moray to the United Irishmen. He failed in that endeavour. You'll notice that Montalto House at that stage is only 2 stories high. It's now 3 stories, but that didn't happen until 1840 with the new owners, the Carrs. Now, the approach to the rebellion started during the late 1790s. Everyone knew that there was going to be a rebellion. There had been a rebellion of the French against their rulers in the 1770s. There had been a rebellion of the Americans against their rulers in the 1780s, and everyone knew that there would be a similar explosion in Ireland. And it was inevitable come December 1796 when the French launched an attempted invasion of Ireland in company with Wolfe Tone. So government didn't listen to the rumours any longer. It was now apparent that the French would try to invade, would try to join with the putative Irish rebels, and would try to overthrow English rule. So Dublin Castle declared martial law in County Down, and arms searches began to find all the arms that had been stored in preparation for the rebellion. And the army used pretty compelling methods to obtain information and to find the arms. So the 2 techniques, this was straightforward torture. The 2 techniques were called the triangles, which is where you strung up somebody to a triangular frame and took the skin of his back with a cat of 9 tails until he gave you the information you wanted. Or you had a brown paper cap coated with tar, heated in a brazier, and then applied to someone's scalp. and then you let him run off round the fields looking for water to put out the fire in his hair. So torture was actually illegal in the British Isles at that stage, but nevertheless the army used excessive methods. Now, I mentioned the second Earl of Moray was now resident in Montalto. So he began collecting witness statements from victims of the atrocities. And he exposed these army atrocities in the British House of Lords and in the Irish House of Lords. The Irish Parliament is still open at this stage. That's an illustration at the bottom there of the Irish Parliament on the green opposite, on College Green opposite Trinity. So on Monday, the 19th of February, 1798, Moray made a long speech in the House of Lords exposing the atrocities. And along the way, he praised his own tenants in Ballynahinch and said that they wouldn't engage in rebellion. In fact, there was no town so loyal as Ballynahinch. So the Lord Chancellor, John Fitzgibbon, was an advocate of strong measures, and he was scathing about the loyalty of Moira's tenants. He said, I am very well satisfied, he said, that Ballynahinch, next after Belfast, is one of the rankest citadels of treason in the Kingdom of Ireland. So that was a bit of an exaggeration. Sainfield actually was worse. Dublin Castle thought that they would have to shut Moray up and discourage him from being so talkative. So the general officer commanding General Lake organised a search of Montalto, no less, and he conducted the search personally. And do you know, he found some hidden arms in Montalto. So Moray took the hint that Dublin Castle were getting very heavy, and he thought there might be an accidental fire at Montalto if he didn't look out. So he evacuated the precious library accumulated by his father. He evacuated it and sent it off to England. I told you that the French had attempted an invasion of attempting a landing in Bantry Bay, 1796. The weather defeated them, and they couldn't land. Wolfe Tone, who had visited Montalto earlier, was with the French, but they couldn't come to land. The engraving top right shows the French on the sea and the yeomen assembling on land to oppose them. Now, knowledge of this plot was, Moray said that his tenants in Ballynahinch were loyal, but not all of them were, and some of them were engaged in active treason. And the military committee of the United Irishmen met in Ballynahinch on the square in Armstrong's Inn. So Armstrong's Inn is demolished long ago, but the site of it is the successor in Macaulay's Inn on the corner of the square. So that's where the United Irishmen met in 1797 and discussed the invasion of Ireland by the French. So they were aware of French plans, and they were keen to cooperate with the French. So whether Lord Moray knew it or not, active treason was being plotted in Ballynahinch. But the United Irishmen imagined that they were a secret society, but in fact they were riddled with informers. And one of the most important informers was a young Catholic farmer from Sainfield, from Lessons in Sainfield. And he was called Nicholas McGean, and he had a photographic memory. So he attended all the United Irish committee meetings, went home and recorded from memory all the proceedings, and that's his beautiful copper plate handwriting on the left-hand side. Then he went to Saintfield House, occupied by the landlord of Saintfield, Nicholas Price, provided him with all the information, and within 24 hours that information was in Dublin Castle and in the hands of the army. Another well-known informer within the who was close to the United Irishmen was Edward John Newell of Downpatrick, a portrait painter. So the fact of the matter was that Dublin Castle knew more about the plans of the United Irishmen than a whole lot of United Irishmen did. So there was no awareness that there was going to be a rebellion, but the army always knew what the plans were, and they always knew who was going to lead the rebellion. So Thomas Russell from Cork, who had been in the army and served in India, he was the first general elected to lead the United Irishmen. So he was arrested and interned in 1796. And this happened to a succession of putative generals for the United Men. So by the time it got to 1798, they'd got through a lot of generals who had been imprisoned, and their last hope was the gentleman on the top right, the Reverend Dr. William Steele Dixon, ex-moderator of the Presbyterian Church and currently minister of Portaferry Presbyterian Church. So Dixon knew when the rebellion was due to kick off, and he arrived in Ballynahinch, and he stayed in Armstrong's Inn, waiting for the rebellion to kick off. But again, Nicholas McGeehan had been very busy telling the army that the rebellion was about to start. Steele Dixon was about to lead it. So Lord Annesley, then resident at Mount Panther, sent some of the Castlewell yeomen to Armstrong's Inn on the 5th of June 1798 and arrested Steele Dixon. And you see Steele Dixon's arrest taking place in the painting by Betty Brown, top left. So always the rebels were up against good government intelligence, and always the leadership was being decapitated. General Lake had only a small garrison in Ireland and in Ulster, and every local big house wanted a guard of soldiers. And he said, "This is impossible. I've only got a small garrison. And if you try to guard everything, you guard nothing." So what he said is, "I'm going to keep my army intact centrally and then act against the main threats. But I am not going to put a soldier at every lamppost." So that meant that big houses like Montalto, or Tullymore in Bransford, or Mount Stewart in Grey Abbey, if they asked for guards, they couldn't have them. And in fact, they were warned that the rebellion was coming and they had better evacuate. So Colonel Bainbridge, who was in Ballynahinch that day arresting Steele Dixon, went on to Montalto and told Lady Mora, "Right, it's time to go. Ballynahinch could easily be occupied, and we can't defend you." And the same warning was delivered to Lady Roden in Tullymore. So definitely the rebellion is about to happen, and the warnings are going out. Now, the local Presbyterian clergyman, the Reverend Samuel Edgar, minister of the seceding Presbyterians in Ballynahinch. Later that church became Eden Grove Presbyterian. I haven't got a picture of him, but this is a picture of the son, so I'm using it as a substitute. So on the 9th of June, the rebellion broke out in County Down, and you got the Battle of Saintfield. There were ripples in Ballynahinch. So Edgar, riding through Ballynahinch at 10 o'clock in the morning, noticed that the town was empty. People were gathering in little groups. Something seemed to be up. And then when he came back later in the day, he heard that the Castlewell yeomen had brought a prisoner through the town, and the townspeople attacked the Castlewell yeomen and rescued the prisoner. And one of the townsmen was shot and killed in that scuffle. So the Castlewell yeomen then left without the prisoner. Actually, the local townsmen captured some of the Castlewell yeomen and took them prisoner. So Edgar and everybody else knows that this can't happen without retaliation. If you attack the yeomen, then you can be sure that the army will strike back. Edgar, who at that stage lived in Mohernock, when he went to Mohernock, he discovered that the locals were digging up concealed barrels of gunpowder. And they wondered if the gunpowder might be damp after it had been buried for so long. So they lit a match to test if it was okay, and it was okay, and it exploded. And a girl was standing too close to it, and she received bad second-degree burns. So she would be in severe trouble with the military authorities later. So this is Ballynahinch in Mohernock townland and elsewhere mobilising for a rebellion. As Edgar rode along, he saw pikes being sharpened. So a pike was a spear mounted on a pole which would be 7 or 8 foot long, and it would have a hook on the side of it. And he said these were frightful weapons, and he saw them being sharpened at every house he passed. Now, the pikes look pretty primitive, and you think that if they were up against a horseman with a sabre and a couple of pistols, that the pikemen wouldn't have much chance. But if you've got a 7 or 8 foot pike, the horseman can't get anywhere near you. The length of his sabre and the length of his arm isn't enough to get at the holder of the pike. So in fact, a couple of pikemen can hold a horseman at bay. And better than that, there's a hook on the pike. So you can one pikeman can put a hook into the horse's reins, and the other pikeman can go around the back and put another hook into the belt of the trooper and pull the horseman off his saddle. And then once he's on the ground, it might be a primitive spear, but it'll still kill the cavalrymen. So you can see cavalry in operation in those two sections on the right-hand side. You can see the cavalrymen in operation at the Battle of Ballynahinch, but up against pikemen, they had significant opposition. Now, Edgar went home that Saturday, and then next morning he was up at dawn, and what he was doing was composing his sermon for the Sunday service. So at dawn he heard shooting, and what had happened was he was expecting retaliation from the army into Ballynahinch, and sure enough it arrived at dawn on Sunday morning, where the Argyll Fencibles had left their base at Blaris Camp, near where Sprucefield roundabout is now. Marched into Ballynahinch, chased the rebels out. The rebels took refuge in Lord Mora's domain down by the river, where the Riverside Walk is now. So the Argyll fencibles coming from Blaris then chased into the domains and captured some of the rebels, but most of the rebels took off towards the rebel camp at Sainfield. That's Sunday. So Monday, there's no actual fighting, but the rebels have assembled at Sainfield, and reinforcements are coming in from Castlereagh and Killinchy and Ballywalter and wherever. And so General Monroe gets them organised in Sainfield, and he sends a vanguard ahead to Ballynahinch. And the vanguard is led by David Bailey Warden. And David Bailey Warden is a probationer Presbyterian clergyman. And he's accompanied by another probationer called Hull and another one called Townsend. So the Presbyterians are well represented in the vanguard, which goes ahead to Ballynahinch. Now, the main road from Ballynahinch from Sainfield to Ballynahinch in those days is what is now the Drumnaconnell Road, and that road hasn't changed much in the meantime. So you can see it winding uphill and down Dale here, very narrow. So Warden goes down that road on the Monday, and on the Tuesday lunchtime, Monroe and 5,000 United Irishmen go down it on the way to Ballynahinch, and on the Tuesday evening, General Nugent with 1,000 men and 6 cannon and a troop of cavalry, they go down that road. So you can imagine the congestion on that wee narrow road on the way to Ballynahinch. Now, Warden is in charge of the vanguard, and the United Irishmen always picked a tall hill as their headquarters, and that's what Warden did in Ballynahinch. He chose Edenavady Hill as his headquarters. So he had just arrived there. The men under his command were from the Newtownards area, and they had done some fighting at Newtownards. They'd assembled at Scrabo. They'd marched on to Sainfield, all without sleep and all without getting fed. So when they got to Ballynahinch, they wanted to know from Warden where their bed and breakfast accommodation would be and what they would order for their breakfast. And Warden was unable to accommodate their demands. So they promptly deserted, and they started heading back home out over Windmill Hill. So Warden reminded them that they were under military discipline, drew his sword, ran to the front of them, and said that any man who took a step further would lose his head. So he got them settled down and took them back to Edenavady Hill. But this shows the degree of disorganisation with the rebels, that the leadership had always been arrested before they could get properly organised. So this is not a good prognostication for how well they would manage whenever the fighting actually broke out. Now, if you look at this map, you see the strategic priorities of the two sides. The government's priority and General Nugent's priority was to keep connections open between Belfast and Dublin. So that meant that you had to keep the main road open through Lisburn, Hillsborough, Drumore, Banbridge. So his primary priority in the north was to preserve Belfast. The soldiers who had come through Ballynahinch on a Sunday morning went on to Downpatrick, but he decided that Downpatrick wasn't that important, so later on he withdrew them. He wasn't too interested in Ballynahinch. He went to Ballynahinch to defeat the rebels, but he didn't care about occupying and holding Ballynahinch. It was not on his list of priorities the way Belfast was. Now, from the rebel point of view, the fighting had broken out accidentally, nearly, in Saintfield on the Saturday. But the real plan was for the rebels to concentrate on Ballynahinch. There were two paramilitary forces in County Down at the time. There was the United Irishmen, who were mostly Presbyterian, and there were the Defenders, who were mostly Catholic. And the United Irishmen were very keen to recruit the Defenders to their cause. So sure enough, the Defenders assembled at Loughan Island. And the thing is, the plan was that they would come to Ballynahinch and join the United Irishmen, along with all the other contingents who were coming in. Once an army had concentrated in Ballynahinch, they intended to march on Lisburn. Lisburn being having the Union Bridge between County Down and County Antrim. So if you captured Lisburn, you prevented military communication between the two counties. And then if you captured Lisburn, then the next thing was to march on Belfast and capture it. So that was the plan. Let's see how it worked out. Telling you about the United Irishmen, founded by William Drennan, second from the right, a medical doctor, prominent Presbyterian, son of the manse, Rosemary Street Presbyterian in Belfast. So his concept for the United Irishmen would be a cordial union of Protestant, Catholic and dissenter. So as it shaped up, you had Protestants like Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone was an Anglican from Dublin, a barrister. You had Catholics like Charles and Bartholomew Teeling, who were linen merchants, Catholics from Poleglass. William Drennan, son of the manse, and very prominent Samuel Nielsen, another son of the manse. His father was a Presbyterian minister in Ballyrone. So first of all, the United Irishmen were a political ginger group, and they lobbied for legislative change for admission to Parliament. But not getting anywhere, in 1795 they militarised and became a paramilitary force. And they decided that the only way you would get political reform and admission of Presbyterians and Catholics to Parliament, the only way was to engage in revolutionary activity the same way as the American colonists had engaged in revolution against the British Crown. When Warden came to Ballynahinch, Monroe, still in charge in Saintfield, sent a letter to Warden. And it said, "Worthy citizens, we've had some reinforcements, about 100 men. I've heard you have had much more. I hope the Defenders have rallied to you." Now, the question was, would the Catholics who had assembled at Loughan Island, would the Catholics come along and assist the United Irishmen? But the Defenders were smarter than that. They didn't like the sound of the way this rebellion was shaping up, that every time a general was elected, he got arrested. It was obvious that the United Irishmen were not really a secret society, and the government were far too well informed about them. So the Defenders stayed clear. So that left Monroe's army to be largely Presbyterian, largely from North Down and the Orange Peninsula, a sprinkling of Anglicans, and just a few Catholics. So the contingents came in from Castlereagh, Bangor, Conlig, Killinchy, Ballywalter, Newtownards, Grey Abbey, Broomheads near Lisburn, and a small amount of Catholics from Ardbryn near Kate's Bridge. We've got a good eyewitness who tells us what Monroe's. So Monroe then came to Ballynahinch on the morning of the 12th, and the main encampment was on Edenavady Hill within the Montalto domain. So we've got a good eyewitness who can describe what the camp looked like at Montalto. So he said there was a mixed and motley multitude, some walking about, others stretched in the green turf. A considerable number sheltering themselves from it was a terrific summer, so there was a hot sun, so they lay under the trees, and many going to sleep. Now, they didn't wear uniforms, but what they did wear was their Sunday suits. The wives all sent them out. If you're going to fight a battle, you better be well dressed. So they all wore their Sunday suit. The only thing in which they all concurred was the wearing of green. Every individual having a knot of ribbons of that colour in his hat. Most of them had buttonholes decorated with laurels from the adjoining grounds. Now, does any of this sound familiar? That in July, men assemble in a field, and after marching, they lie down and have a wee sleep before they march home again. And they wear colours. Does this remind you of the 12th of July and the field? The only difference being that the Orange men were orange and the United Irishmen wore green. The witness is Professor James Thompson, who was a 16-year-old at that stage, and he lived at Spa. So we can be sure that he's a good witness, because come 1832 he was appointed Professor of Mathematics at Glasgow University. So we can be sure that his testimony would be accurate. So he says he and some of the servant girls from Spa went along at 1 o'clock on the 12th to supply food to the rebels. So that consisted of oat cakes and boiled portions of salted beef and bacon. And he said when they arrived on Edenavady, there was a large number of females, servants or the daughters of or the wives of courtiers, all on the same business of supplying food to the rebels. So an area was designated where they would deposit the food. And he says the rebels were very well conducted, and the soldiers were very, very respectful to the women who were bringing the food. But suddenly they noticed, and you get a good view over the countryside from Edenavady, but looking out towards Downpatrick, they saw a company of redcoats arriving. So that changed the atmosphere on Edenavady, and it was no longer sort of a festival atmosphere like the 12th field. Suddenly you know that they're about to come under attack, and all was bustle. And the woman, Anne Thompson, the teenage eyewitness, they got offside very quickly. Next thing, looking out towards Belfast, they noticed that farms were being set on fire. Now, General Nugent had issued a proclamation saying that if Saintfield and Ballynahinch didn't surrender, that he would burn both of them to the ground. And marching from Saintfield to Ballynahinch, he carried out that threat. So every farm he passed, he put it on fire. Now, the idea was to intimidate the rebels in Ballynahinch. It didn't have that effect. It enraged them when they saw good farms from their neighbours being burned down. So, A, they know the army is coming, and B, they intend to fight it. General Nugent's force coming from Belfast via Saintfield consisted of the Monaghan Militia, the Fife Fencibles, the 22nd Light Dragoons, the Royal Artillery, Belfast Yeomen, and Orange Auxiliaries. Now, the Monaghan Militia are county regiments. They're recruited in Ireland by county. They weren't allowed to fight in their own county, so the Downshire Militia, they were sent elsewhere to Ireland to fight, and the Monaghan Militia, they were sent to County Down. The 5 fencible regiments were defensible regiments. They were sort of TA regiments. They were veterans who had retired and then they were brought back into service. And they were supposed to be local service only, but they were persuaded to cross the North Channel and fight in Ulster. The Royal Artillery and the 22nd Light Dragoons, they were regular army. And the only 2 regular regiments in Nugent's army. The rest of them were sort of auxiliary forces. The Belfast Yeomen were part-time soldiers, unlike the Monaghan Militia, which were full-time. And Nugent was so desperate to recruit extras that anybody from the Orange Order in Belfast who wanted to come along and fight, then he said, sure, come along and help. So the first fighting in Ballynahinch occurred on the 12th of June. In the late afternoon, the Nugent started off on Drumnaconnell Road in Saintfield, and then as you come near Ballynahinch, that becomes the Ballylone Road, and here you have Bell's Bridge and Bell's Farm on the hill on the right. So the United men set up an ambush here. And the ambush is carefully planned. You see the marshy ground on the left-hand side where the river runs. Now, the army are bound to cross that bridge. They can't take to the fields with 6 cannon. A cannon weighs half a ton, so you take it into that marshy ground and you'll never get it back out again. So the army's got to cross the bridge. So it's a choke point. So if the United men can block the road at that point, then Nugent's army can't come any farther. But Nugent doesn't hang around. There's the ambush point, bottom right. There's Nugent's approach road, top right. And you see from this aerial photograph that there's a ring fort near Ballylone Road. So Nugent takes a couple of his cannon and sights them in the ring fort, and he gets the cannon to loose off a couple of 6-pound balls towards the rebels on the hill. And muskets are short range and not very accurate, but cannon balls are long range and are accurate. So it's not too long before the rebels at Bell's Bridge change their mind and retreat from that position. Now, in later years, someone exploring that ring fort discovered those cannonballs, and they're still available if you ask to see them. So Nugent's men departed in a hurry and forgot to take all of their cannonballs with them. The cannons that Nugent had aren't the huge cannon that you see in Carrickfergus Castle, for instance. These are only 6-pounders, and 6-pounders are easy enough, comparatively easy, to transport across the countryside, towed by horses. So they don't look very big, but a 6-pound cannonball can do a fierce amount of damage. If it hits a row of soldiers, it'll cut its way through several rows of soldiers, killing them all as it goes. Kicks up a lot of smoke, both from the muzzle and at the other end where the fuse is. Nugent brought 6 cannon with him, or rather, he brought 4 6-pound cannon, and he brought 2 howitzers. And you can see some of the details of the brass cannon there in Thomas Robinson's painting, and the tools that are used to load the cannon with. So a cannon, when it was crossing country, was attached to a limber, and the limber held the gunpowder and it held the cannonballs, and then the whole ensemble would be towed by 4 horses or 2 horses. So you needed quite a team to operate the cannon, but you also needed a team to look after the horses. Now, Thompson said that the rebels could see an approach from Saintfield, and they could see an approach from Downpatrick. So on the map here, you see General Nugent coming from Saintfield down Ballylone Road, and then you can see Colonel Stewart coming from Downpatrick. Now, Colonel Stewart doesn't come through Annacot. He comes down the Drumnaconacher Road. Now, not the Drumnaconnell Road, but the Drumnaconacher Road. So Stewart had been in Ballynahinch on the Sunday morning with the Argyll Fencibles. He now comes back to Ballynahinch on the instructions of Nugent. The United men gathered in Windmill Hill see that Stewart has got quite a small detachment. So they have a great idea. Look, why don't we capture and attack and capture Stewart's Argylls before the 2 contingents join up. We can't defeat the large contingent, but we can defeat the small one. So Nugent sees what they're up to, and he distributes his men. So he distributes his men in an L-shaped formation with the 5 Fencibles along one wing and the Monaghan Militia on the other wing, and this makes it two thin red lines, and this makes it more difficult for the rebels to surround them. So then the 2 contingents are able to unite without molestation. Colonel Stewart's contingent coming from Downpatrick consists, as I've said, of the Argyll Fencibles. Some York Fencibles, again, they're a full-time TA regiment from the north of England. 3 contingents of yeomen, Kilmore, Seaford and Inch. Now, the yeomen have a strong connection with the Orange Order. At the same time as sort of 1797, you had a lot of recruitment to the Orange Order in the approach to the 1798 rebellion. So lodges were formed in Kilmore, Seaford, Inch, and in a lot more towns. And shortly after you got the foundation of a local lodge, you got the foundation of a local yeomanry corps. And the Inch yeomen, their lodge is in Inch, of course, and the Orange Lodge is Orange Lodge number 431, still in existence. So that entire Orange Lodge was recruited into the Inch yeomen, and one of them was killed at the Battle of Ballynahinch. And as in Belfast, General Nugent said, we need all the men we can get. So his instructions to Colonel Stewart in Downpatrick were get all the Orange men that you can, collect them, bring them to Ballynahinch with you. The uniforms, the army at that stage all wore red coats. Every regiment wore red coats, but then their headgear would differ, their trousers would differ, and the trimmings on the red coat would differ. There'd be different colours. They all had white cross belts. All were armed with the Brown Bess musket. So nowadays we reckon that a 45 bullet is heavy gauge, but they fired 3/4 inch bullets, muskets. The musket they were called brown bess muskets, and they were used for 50 years or more without the pattern changing. The musket itself weighed 7 pounds. The calibre was .75. It fired 3 to 4 rounds a minute, but that was with the very best infantry, very well trained ones. With auxiliaries like the yeomen, they'd be much slower at reloading. The range was 100 yards only, and they were inaccurate. If you aimed at a target, you'd be lucky to hit it. The value of the brown bess musket was if you fired 100 of them together, you were bound to hit something. Slow to load, it needed a ramrod, and it had a complicated and primitive firing mechanism, relying on a flint of all things, and an open pan. And in wet weather, the thing just wouldn't work. The flint wouldn't fire. Right, General Nugent has united his Belfast and his Downpatrick contingents, and now they march on Windmill Hill, because as well as occupying Edenavady Hill, General Munro has sent a detachment under a man called McCants to occupy Windmill Hill. So on Windmill Hill, Nugent chases the rebels off it, and famously he captures Hugh McCulloch. Hugh McCulloch, who's a banger from Saintfield. You can see that he is definitely dressed in his Sunday's clothes because he's got a clawhammer coat on and thigh-length riding boots and a nice waistcoat. And like Thompson said, he wears green, so he's wearing a green cravat. Other thing to notice is that he's got very short hair. In those days, men wore their hair long, so McCulloch has cut his hair short, and it's called the croppy hairstyle, and rebels of that period would be called croppies. So McCulloch is captured on Windmill Hill, gets a drumhead court-martial, and is promptly hanged as a rebel, and is hanged from the sails of the windmill. You can see one of the troopers with a length of rope in his hand, and that's about to elevate McCulloch on the sails of the windmill. Right, Nugent captures Windmill Hill, and then General Barber, who's in charge of the artillery, lines up the cannon and starts bombarding Ballynahinch. And he uses his mortars, his howitzers. And they fire cannonballs, but they're hollow cannonballs, and they're filled with gunpowder and they're filled with shrapnel. And the hole on the side is for a fuse. So he fires the cannonball, he lights the fuse, fires the cannonball. As the cannonball goes through the air, you can see smoke coming out of the fuse. And then once it reaches the centre of Ballynahinch, before it hits the ground, it explodes. The cannonball disintegrates and fires shrapnel all over the place. The hot shrapnel then puts Ballynahinch on fire because all the houses at that stage are thatched, so a lot of houses go on fire. And you can see where the market house was. One of the cannonballs took the roof off the market house. Market house, brand new then. It had only been opened in 1795. And you can see the trajectory of the cannonball rounds. That's First Ballynahinch Presbyterian Church on the extreme left there. So the cannonballs being fired off Windmill Hill would be sailing out over the top of the church roof on their way to Ballynahinch. Now this persuaded the rebels to vacate the town promptly and then withdraw and congregate on Edenavady Hill, having evacuated Windmill Hill. Thompson again describes the fighting on Windmill Hill. He says it started about 6 o'clock in the evening. fighting was carried on with cannon and muskets and stopped about 9 o'clock. He says the military were bound to win that confrontation because they had better equipment and better discipline. He didn't think there was a lot of injuries done on either side, but the United men were scared enough to vacate the town. And the United men were very scared because Thompson, who lived at Spa and had retreated to Spa at that stage, said that as they were at Spa overnight, mass desertions began from the United men. He also gave the details about how the rebels were armed. He said the majority of them had pikes, which were deadly in a close fight, but no good if you were at 100 yards distance. It describes the pikes as having a shaft 8 feet long, sharpened heads of steel, and a hook for pulling a horseman out of his seat. Some of the rebels had swords, not very good ones. Some were equipped merely with pitchforks. Those who were more prosperous and had higher income had guns. So you couldn't say that the rebels were terribly well armed against 1,000 redcoats armed with cannon, and each of them armed with a brown-based musket. And there were also 7 or 8 pieces of small cannon, he said. Now, these were small swivel cannon. I told you that one of the Presbyterian clergymen, or trainee clergymen, was called Hull. His daddy was the Presbyterian minister in Bangor and had previously been the moderator. So young Mr. Hull liberated 8 cannon from a barge in Bangor harbour and brought them with him and used them at the battle. What they did was tie the cannon barrel to a farm cart. Didn't work terribly well because the recoil of the cannon shook the cannon free. Hull mounted, the main army was on Edenavady Hill. Hull took his cannon onto the hill near that, where St. Patrick's Chapel is now, and Hull then bombarded Nugent's army on Windmill Hill with the swivel cannon. So Thompson, who lived at Annach at Spa Crossroads, then recorded that all during the night there were mass desertions, and not a lot of injuries during the first phase of the battle, but some, and certainly enough to frighten them and to make them run even harder. And the other thing he noticed was that they were parched. I told you this was a very hot summer. So the fighting on Windmill Hill and the fright on Edenavady Hill, they hadn't had enough to drink. So they were dehydrated, and anything that Thompson could give them to drink, they were grateful for. So they were thoroughly alarmed and disillusioned and keen to get back home. So Monroe's army was diminishing visibly overnight. The fighting started again, Thompson says, Thompson is a great witness and gives you precise details of what happened when. So he tells you at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Now this is June, so daylight was still some time off. But at 3 o'clock, Nugent said, "Burn Ballynahinch down." So that enraged the rebels, and that started young Mr. Hull on Church Hill to recommence his bombardment of Nugent's army on Windmill Hill. So the Nugent replied this time not with the howitzers, but with the 6-pound cannon. Thompson said this was a much heavier fire on the second day. Nugent at daylight sent 2 cannon to the mouth of what we called Dromore Street, what they called Bridge Street then. And the rebels, you can see Edenavady in the distance, that's where the rebels are assembled. So Nugent intends to attack the rebels on Edenavady Hill. So he starts to bombard Dromore Street, and he uses what's called grape shot or canister. So instead of using cannonballs, he uses a type of ammunition. It's a tin can. It's filled with fragments of metal. You insert it into a cannon and you fire it as usual. When that tin can comes out of the barrel of the cannon, it acts like a shotgun cartridge and it spreads in a fan, and it'll cut down anything in its path at 100 yards. So the rebels at the bottom of, hiding around the corner at the bottom of Dromore Street, could hear the grape shot bouncing off the walls, bouncing like hailstones. Now, it didn't stop the rebels. The thing is, you can only fire that cannon 2 or 3 times per minute. So in the intervals between the cannon firing, then the pikemen came up Dromore Street. And you have to defend the cannon. So if you don't defend the cannon, then it's in danger of being captured by the other side's infantry. And that's what happened. So the pikemen were... Naturally, they were in great danger because of the grape shot, but they weren't deterred, and eventually they captured the cannon. And in fact, they tried to turn the cannon around and use it against the Monaghan Militia. Couldn't manage that, so a lot of pubs on Dromore Street at the time, and each pub had a cellar where you put the beer barrels into the cellar. So what the rebels did was to put the cannon down the steps into one of the pub cellars, so it couldn't be retrieved. Right, let's explain how the battle developed. On the left, you have Edenavady Hill. Monroe sends one thrust out of Montalto gates onto Dromore Street, across the bridge and up Dromore Street. And I've described the fighting there, where they captured the cannon and put the Monaghan Militia to flight. Then Monroe sent another thrust, again across the river, but on land this time, and coming out onto Church Street at Bahardroll Parish Church. And what he wants to do is relieve Mr. Hull, who's on Church Hill and under attack from General Nugent. So he relieves Hull, and then they both swing left and go down Church Street and join the other thrust, which is coming out Dromore Street. So they join up at the top of High Street, and they keep pushing the Monaghan Militia all the way down High Street, across the square, and down Meeting House Street, which we now call Windmill Street. So there's Windmill Street looking from the square. So the Monaghan Militia aren't making a great fist of the fighting, and the rebels have them on the retreat. So again, Thompson takes up the story. On the morning of the 13th of June, the army brought their cannon to the top of Dromore Street, but the pikemen advanced up each side, assailed the Monaghan Militia, who abandoned their cannon. the rebels tried to work the cannon but couldn't manage it. So the Monaghan Militia retreated all the way down Meeting House Street as far as the old Meeting House, with the rebels pursuing and fighting with great vigour. So you can see the old Meeting House. It's the very last building on the left, First Presbyterian. So local army officers like Colonel Matthew Ford from Seaford is pretty disappointed about what's going on. He thought the rebels would be easier to defeat, so his opinion was, damn these stiff-necked Presbyterians, they won't run. What he's worried about is, number one, he's going to be defeated. Number two, a lot of these Presbyterians are going to end up dead, and a lot of them are his own tenants. So the tenants who farm his lands and provide him with an income, a lot of them are going to be killed. So he doesn't like the look of what's going on. General Nugent thinks that he's about to lose the Battle of Ballynahinch. This is the old Meeting House, First Presbyterian, and this is Nugent's view of the rebels coming down Meeting House Street. So remember, I told you what his priorities were. He doesn't care about losing Ballynahinch. His big fear is, will he lose Belfast? And he needs his army intact to preserve Belfast, and he's not about to hang around to see his army defeated in Ballynahinch. So his idea is, look, this is going the wrong way, so let's get out of the town, let's preserve the army intact, let's get back to Belfast where we're more needed. So he retreats back to Belfast. Remember, the road system is quite different then. So his route back to Belfast is over Windmill Hill, back onto Ballylone Road and back through Saintfield to Belfast. That was the route then. Now, to make a quick retreat, you can't make a quick retreat if you've got cannon with you. So he abandons the cannon. He drives them into Belfast, into Ballynahinch Loch. Ballynahinch Loch then is just a marsh now, and is drained, and you can only see where the outline was. But then it was a body of water. So the cannon were abandoned in the loch. If you drive the cannon into deep mud, it'll take hours to get them back out again. So there's no chance of the rebels retrieving them and using them against you. So it looks like the Battle of Ballynahinch is decided, but it's not, you know. Nugent is a canny old, experienced veteran. He's fought in the American War of Independence, and he always has a trick or two up his sleeve. So at the top of the map you see the rebel attack in green heading down Windmill Street and past the loch and driving Nugent up Windmill Lane. And the rebels think that they're driving all before them and they're about to win. But what they don't know, if you look at the red arrow, overnight, Nugent, do you remember the contingent which arrived from Downpatrick? Well, Nugent detaches it again, and he sends it off Windmill Hill, and he sends it down through what are now, over the river, and through what are now the Millbridge playing fields, and up onto Crabtree Hill. And the rebels there distributed throughout the Montalto domain as far as their right wing is distributed as far as the Millbridge, the bridge over the river at the watermill. So the rebels they can hear the fighting going in Ballynahinch, but all is quiet on their right wing at Millbridge. But the next thing they know, as they're settling down to their scrambled egg and toast, is that some shells start landing among them, fired from this position here on the Crabtree Hill. As Thompson puts it, At an early period, a detachment of the king's forces was sent round with some pieces of artillery to flank the rebels. They possessed themselves of a small hill about a mile distance from where I was at Spa. This manoeuvre and the galling fire which succeeded it greatly disconcerted the rebels and no doubt contributed to the success of the military. So Stuart and the Argyll Fencibles they advanced down the Crabtree Road. They come onto Church Road. The rebels again are pretty courageous and they come right out onto Church Road and attack the Argyll Fencibles. And as in Dromore Street, there's one cannon and there's one howitzer. So the cannon is again loaded up with grape shot, and it discourages the rebels and makes them take off back into the domain. So Thompson describes he can't see, but he can hear. So he says the scene about sunrise was terrific and sublime. Smoke and flames from the burning village, incessant discharges from the muskets, flashes of the cannon, loud reports from the cannon, which then echoed from the neighbouring mountains. So loud that you thought the mountains were coming tumbling down. The occasional bursting of a bombshell, that's the mortars in the air. A scene new to all onlookers and to most of the combatants, calculated to impress everyone with awe. So we can actually see Thomas Robinson in this painting must have been present during the battle, and he's recorded all of the details. So the red arrow shows the line of the Argyll Fencibles advancing through Montalto domain from Crabtree Hill. And you can see at the end of the arrow that is Edenavady Hill, which was the rebels' headquarters. Go to the section of the painting at the top, and you can see Montalto House, and you can see Edenavady Hill on the right-hand side. Now, behind Edenavady Hill, you see red. So look closer at the enlargement, and those are the famous thin red lines. So you see two thin red lines advancing through the domain. And look at the top painting. Do you see the huge clouds of white smoke which have been thrown up? Now, I'll tell you what's going on here. This is called a platoon fire. So you assemble your redcoats in thin lines, and you think, well, they wouldn't be too hard to knock down. The cavalry would make mincemeat of them. Not a bit of it. The first line fires its muskets, so 100 muskets get fired at once. Now, like I told you, muskets are inaccurate, but you fire 100 at once, and they're bound to hit something. And it's a wall of lead, and it's like a machine gun. The first rank fires, and then they kneel down. Then the second rank fires, and they kneel down. Then the third rank fires, and then they kneel down. So you have one continuous stream of lead coming at the enemy. Now, meantime, the first rank kneeling down, they're reloading. So they stand up and fire and kneel down. Then the second rank, which have reloaded, they stand up and fire. So you get what's called a ripple of platoon fire, where you get a continuous, uninterrupted stream of lead. So if you look at the picture at the bottom, you have the Fencibles advancing through the Montalto domain, driving the rebels before them inexorably. I told you about Captain Evatt. Captain Evatt, the Monaghan Militia were Catholics, most of them, but as happened with most of the militia regiments in Ireland, but the officers were Protestants. And Captain Evatt from near the town of Monaghan, he came from Mount Louise. He was both a Protestant and an Orangeman. Thompson records how Captain Evatt was killed. His death enraged the Monaghan Militia, and they didn't have much mercy subsequently on the rebels after their adjutant had been killed. The fighting then, some fighting in proximity to Montalto House. And the rebels occupied Montalto House and fired out at the Monaghan Militia. So the Monaghans, they got out of control and they set Montalto House on fire. So this horrified the establishment. General Nugent had ordered that Ballynahinch be burned, but that's a very different thing from burning down Lord Morris's mansion. So Nugent ordered the troops to go down to Montalto Lake and get water and put the fire out. So when the report went back to Dublin Castle, the explanation was the horrid acts of the rebels created such a paroxysm of revenge that even General Nugent could not restrain the Monaghan Militia from despoiling Montalto. But the fire was put out and not much damage done to the house. There were reenactments of the battle in the streets of the town and at Montalto by the Game and Harvest Festival in 2014 and 2016. Pretty realistic reenactments, although the numbers involved would have been much larger. Pretty amusing sequel to the reenactment. The organisers thought they would have a post-match analysis, same as you would do after match of the day. So the two generals were interviewed on camera and asked how they thought the thing had gone. So presumably General Munro asked for a return fixture. I went to a wedding at Castle Leslie, and Castle Leslie in County Monaghan, and the owner of, at the time of the Battle of Ballynahinch, the owner of Castle Leslie was Colonel Charles Powell Leslie, who commanded the Monaghan Militia in Ballynahinch. So when I was at Castle Leslie, I explained to them that the previous owner of their hotel had burned down my hometown. So they were horrified to hear this, and I don't think they actually believed me. Right, now, the rebel headquarters was on Edenavady, and that's where all their food was. But that also is where all their ammunition is, and where they stored their gunpowder. So if they're advancing into the town and they're firing off their muskets, and Colonel Stewart captures Edenavady and also captures their gunpowder, then fairly soon the rebels in the town are going to run out of gunpowder to fire their muskets. And that's exactly what happened. So Thompson says the rebel army was suffering constant diminution by desertion. And he noticed that their discharge of the muskets was gradually slackening and had almost entirely ceased, it is said, from want of ammunition about 7 in the morning. Again, valuable details. He tells us when the rebels ran out of ammunition. Now, the church was there at that time, but the cemetery hadn't been established, so the church is surrounded by a green. And drawn up on the church green is the 22nd Light Dragoons. So they have taken no part in the fighting so far. But Nugent and his army are busy starting to retreat over Windmill Hill towards Belfast. But then at the last minute, Nugent catches on that the rebels have stopped shooting. And they're retreating in some confusion back up Windmill Street. So he doesn't hesitate. He sets the 22nd Light Dragoons on them. Now, Dragoons, you don't commit cavalrymen carelessly. You won't send them up against pikemen because they'll just get slaughtered. But if you see retreating rebels, then the value of Dragoons is that they keep them on the retreat and they prevent them reforming. So that's what Nugent did. He told the 22nd Light Dragoons to disperse the fleeing rebels all over the countryside, and his instructions to them were, "Go easy on them, boys." A local clergyman, the Reverend Thomas Ledley Birch of Saintfield, said that 58 people were killed during the Battle of Ballynahinch, which isn't too many. And he said that 3 or 4 were killed in the pursuit afterwards. So the thing was that if this had been Leinster and you were up against a Catholic contingent of rebels, the army then were much more severe, and there were many more killed in Leinster than were killed in County Down. The idea was that the government didn't want to alienate the Presbyterian population any more than they needed to. So that accounted for Nugent's instructions to the Dragoons, "Go easy on them, boys." However, the rebels began to retreat, said Thompson, and no, this is Nugent now. The rebels began to retreat and they fled in all directions. I sent out dragoons, which killed great numbers in the retreat. That's an exaggeration. There weren't that many killed. A very great number of the rebels were found concealed in Lord Moray's domain and were killed there. Now, I told you that the troopers were armed with the sabre and with pistols. So when they caught up with one of the rebels, Betsy Gray, number one, they shot her in the eye, and number two, they cut off her. She raised her arm to defend herself, and the sabre then simply cut off her hand. So she was one of the rebels who were killed in the retreat after the battle. So that's much of the detail of the 4 fighting days from beginning to end. I told you that I was at Castle Leslie. And it's now a wedding venue. Larchfield is now a wedding venue as well. In 1798, Larchfield was the residence of Daniel Mussenden, a Presbyterian elder, by the way, from Annacot Presbyterian Church. And Daniel Mussenden established a corps of yeomen, and it's those yeomen who killed Betsy Gray. So again, you can go to a wedding nowadays in Larchfield, but I'm not sure if they will tell you about the association of the death of Betsy. Finishing off about Montalto and Lord Moray. Moray had assured the Irish House of Lords that there was no town so loyal as Ballynahinch. So he was very thoroughly satirised in London by the Prime Minister Pitt and by the future Foreign Secretary George Canning. So Canning wrote a wee satirical poem about Moray. I'm getting near the end of this, by the way. A certain great statesman who all of us know in a certain assembly no long while ago declared from this maxim he never would flinch that no town was so loyal as Ballynahinch. The great statesman, it seems, had perused all their faces and been mightily struck with their loyal grimaces, when each townsman had sung like a throstle or finch, "We are all of us loyal at Ballynahinch." Determined their landlord's fine words to make good, they hid pikes in his haggard, cut staves in his wood, and attacked the king's troops. The assertion to clinch that no town was so loyal as Ballynahinch. So this was terminally embarrassing for Lord Mora. And the battle was fought in June 1798, so he put the Montalto estate on the up for sale in September of the same year. He had estates in Mora. He sold them off in 1804, and he decamped permanently to England, where he developed a very interesting political career. He was best friends with the Prince of Wales, who became George IV, and George IV wanted Mora to be Prime Minister in 1812, but Mora couldn't form a ministry. However, as consolation prize, he was created Governor General of India. And had an interesting career there, adding big chunks of the map to the British Empire, like India, Central India, and Ceylon, and Singapore. The house subsequently was altered. The Carrs bought it in 1800, and then they remodeled it and made it into a three-storey dwelling in 1837. So. My thanks to the people who gave me access to Montalto House, to the people who owned or created the murals, to Albert Titterington for his reenactment of the battle, to Lord Laird for the Battle of Saintfield, Down Museum for the model of Betsy, and Ian Harrison of Ballylone Road, who owns the cannonballs. If you want to check the sources that I used, a lot of them are easily available. Google Books, and there's a lot of information on the Prony website. The Eyewitness account by James Thompson is online as well in the Belfast Magazine, 1825. Macomb's Guide to Belfast is online. And then the textbooks, which you can get in libraries, are written by Charles Dixon or A.T.Q. Stewart, or by Hill, Turner and Dawson, will give you detailed descriptions of the battle. So there you are. The fighting lasted over 4 days, and I hope you know more about it now. Any more tea?
Put the kettle on again.
The saying about Lord Nugent telling people to go light on that.
Yeah.
What's the story where some, being a very hot day, some of his soldiers were getting buttermilk at the farm?
Yeah.
Just on the outskirts.
Annacot Bridge. The victim was called Burrowes.
Where was it?
Annacot Bridge. Where's the Annacot Bridge? You know the Moss Road in Ballynahinch? If you go out at the end of the Moss Road is Annacot Bridge, which is where the Ballylone Road crosses it.
Yeah.
A man called Burrowes had got a thorn in his thumb. His thumb was septic, so he wrapped it in a bandage. So the militia coming through asked him for a drink of buttermilk. And so So he gave him a drink of buttermilk, but then he was going back to the house. So some of the militia said, see he's wearing...
he must have been a rebel.
Must have been a rebel, and he's got a wound. So they shot him on the spot. So in fact, he was a loyalist.